Well, Ange Postecoglou lasted 39 days as Nottingham Forest manager. Mark, was he doomed from the start, do you think?
Well, I don't think he was doomed from the start, but he had a very difficult job, didn't he? Replacing a manager that was popular with the fans, who had great success last season. The fans never really bought into Ange from the outset, but obviously, pretty soon it was clear that the fans weren't taken to it. The players didn't look like they were taken to his style of play, and Ange didn't help himself. Never mind with his results, but it's just this attitude he has in press conferences. I've never heard him talk about anybody but himself. Every time it's either I'm a fighter, I'm this, I'm that, I'm up for the challenge, and it kind of got a little bit boring, really, a bit repetitive. That he never really gave credit to his players or spoke about his players. So he also had this situation where he was hired by an owner who is notoriously impatient. So I think the results and his attitude and the whole combination of everything meant that it wasn't going to last long. But 39 days is pretty brief, and 19 minutes after the final whistle of the Chelsea game, he was fired. That is pretty brutal. But if we have to give Marinakis credit, the Forest owner, he's realised he's made a mistake and he's dealt with it. He hasn't let it linger on. So looks like Sean Dyche is going to be the next man in. That's debatable whether that's the right decision or not. But I think he's a better choice than Ange.
Well, there's a couple of things I want to pick up there. Firstly, the whole 19 minutes thing, that he was doing him a favour there, because if he'd let him come out and speak to the press and then sacked him, it would have humiliated Ange Postecoglou. The fact that he did it so soon, I think, was actually putting him out of his misery on that. Beth, look, the fact that we're talking about, it looks as though Sean Dyche is getting the job. The fact that the shortlist included Roberto Mancini and Marco Silva, does that not suggest that there isn't exactly an aligned vision for the future, a clear path for where they want to go, if you've got Sean Dyche and Roberto Mancini on the same shortlist?
Yeah, and I think that was the problem from the get-go with Postecoglou, because anyone who's watched Nottingham Forest even once would have told you that he is probably the football manager who is least aligned to the way that they played under Nuno. And I think, if you're a Forest fan, that is the worry, because the owner there has so much power, so much influence. He's such a visible and vocal presence that what he says goes, kind of. And so he's made an impulsive decision there. I think if you'd spoken to anyone with any kind of football brain before appointing Postecoglou, they probably would have said, maybe that's not the best choice. I think actually you'd have got Dyche in straight after Nuno. It might not have been the most inspiring appointment for the fans, but I think you could have at least seen a way of a bit of continuity in terms of how structured his teams are, how defensively robust his teams are, and sort of the comparisons with Nuno, to go the complete other way when you've got players who are a completely different skill set was just totally crazy. But yeah, I think the concern is now, like you say, if that shortlist is to be believed, that those three managers were the three in the frame, three very, very different types of managers, it would show you that Marinakis and the people around him don't really know what they're doing. They're just maybe trying to throw things at the wall and see what sticks. And, I think Dyche is a better appointment. I think maybe not necessarily in terms of, repeating the success of last season, but at least sort of steadying the ship and making them harder to beat, which was probably the biggest strength under Nuno. They were really difficult to beat and to break down. So, yeah, I think if I was a Forest fan, I would be quite concerned that Marinakis and the people around him don't quite have a long-term plan for what they want the club to look like.
I've got to say, I don't actually think there was a shortlist. I think, from what I've been told, that Sean Dyche was always 95% certain to get the job, and that talks had taken place prior to Ange actually being removed, and that this was just an element, that the Mancini link was an element of putting a bit of pressure on Dyche to accept what was on the table rather than demand a bit more. The Marco Silva one, I think, James, what situation is following Marco Silva. Didn't get any money to spend in the summer, wants a new contract at the end of the season, represented by, I think, George Mendes, who obviously has done a lot of work with Nottingham Forest. So there's elements of noise coming out that it suits all parties, but ultimately Sean Dyche was the guy that was going to come into Forest because he's got that track record of getting clubs out of. And let's be fair to Sean Dyche, he got Burnley into Europe. The Everton situation has kind of soured the pitch with Sean Dyche, but he got a club like Burnley into Europe, which is a bit like Nuno getting Forest into Europe last season. Yes, his style of play isn't the most attractive, but it's very similar to Nuno's in the sense that it's defensive and counter-attacking. And also, if you're a Forest fan, you'd probably be a little bit pleased that you've got Sean Dyche, Ian Warne, Steve Stone as coaches that have got a Forest connection. So they are bringing the club back to themselves a little bit. But yeah, you're right. At the end of last season, when Forest qualified for Europe on the Nuno, if you said 6 months later you'll have Ange Postecoglou and then Sean Dyche as your manager before Christmas, probably a little bit of a surprise.
Well, but look, I mean, this is no disrespect to Sean Dyche at all, but what I don't really understand about this is if they were selling the Postecoglou appointment as, well, actually we're transitioning away from Nuno style of football. We want to be more front foot. We've signed players in the summer, more attacking, dynamic players. We want to essentially change the way we play and be more exciting to watch and take control and the initiative in matches. Then why do you go to Sean Dyche?
Do you think it was just considered as that, though? Do you really think Marakis had that plan, or was it just do you think it was more of a personality-driven thing? He'd fallen out with Nuno, and Ange was a guy that, I mean, Ange just said it himself. He met him in Greece last year and was getting an award from it. It's almost like they had a chat at a dinner and got on pretty well for an hour and thought, right, well, next time that I'm sacking the manager, I'm bringing you in. It just doesn't read to me like, I mean, why on earth would you want to transition from that to that, knowing that what that brought you was success? It's just ridiculous. This myth, and we touched on it with the Arsenal thing a bit earlier, this myth that you have to play exciting attacking football as well as winning. The Forest fans loved it last season, and Forest were quite entertaining to watch the way that they played this rapid counter-attack. And so I don't understand these owners that cite wanting to play better football for changing managers.
Well, you mentioned the fans as well. The thing that absolutely shocked me was the fact that the fans were singing the Forest fans were singing to Postecoglou, "You're going to get sacked in the morning," before the international break. I mean, look, I covered it, obviously his whole time at Tottenham. He had a few issues with some of the away fans at Spurs when they were beaten on the road. But there was never en masse did they turn on Postecoglou at home. When they were losing games, it was always towards Daniel Levy or the owners, Enoch. He never faced that kind of criticism and mutiny, if you like, from his own fans. To face that from a group of supporters who you've only met, 4 weeks ago. Beth, I mean, I don't know what you think, but I found that incredible that the Forest fans turned on him so quickly, because if he can argue, I've got to implement a different style of play. I'm blending in new players, new signings. I'm getting to know the club myself. But if the fans are chanting for you to get sacked after 3 or 4 weeks, you're done, aren't you?
Yeah, and I think part of that probably comes down to how popular Nuno was. It's almost like, Nuno was like this really well-liked father figure, and then the stepdad comes in and instantly it's like the fans turn on him and they don't want anything to do with him. So I think that is that in a way, I think he was almost always doomed to fail because of that. I think, unless he came in and got off to a flying start, which obviously he did the exact opposite of that, I think the fans were set against him anyway. But I think Mark's right as well. I think he probably didn't necessarily help himself in terms of the way that he dealt with the media and his stance. I mean, James, you've obviously dealt with him probably more than any of us. Where does he go from here now? Does he have a future in the Premier League? Does he have a future at the top level? Or what is the next step for Postecoglou from here?
I think he's burnt a lot of bridges in England now. I think when he left, the only thing I would say is that when he left Spurs, he left Spurs with tens of thousands of fans lining the street celebrating because they'd won a trophy.
Waving at him, though.
I think when you leave a club after 39 days, that is not solely one person's fault. There is a wider issue. I'm not suggesting that Postecoglou should be absolved of the mistakes that he made. Obviously the record was dreadful, didn't win a game. But the fact is, if you're only given 39 days, there's more going on than just the manager. So he has that to fall back on. I was on the receiving end a couple of times of some short answers from him in press conferences. There were a lot of people who didn't like him because of that. I always respected the fact that you ask him a question, he will answer it. A lot of managers don't do that. He was always up front with his team news. He always gave thought to the sort of bigger topics within the game and was always quite interesting on things like VAR or the calendar or, just sort of the Premier League in general. And speaking to the media that in that way is a big part of it. And he may well be able to convince, another Premier League manager, a Premier League club to give him a managerial job. But it's difficult for him now because he's got two he's got 2 really bad exits on his CV in such a short space of time that it's now going to require a bit of a leap of faith. And it really, because he's so set in his ways, you sort of know the short-term gamble you're taking as a club. You kind of know you're going to get almost all-out attack, and it will probably be quite exciting, but it doesn't really feel sustainable. And he'll argue, of course, well, it was sustainable at Celtic, it was sustainable in Japan, it was sustainable, where he's worked outside of the Premier League. But it doesn't really feel as though, in this day and age, that his type of football is compatible with long-term success in the Premier League. So he faces a fight, I think, to get another job in England. Whether he can get, I'm sure he's well respected in other countries. I'm sure he won't be short of work, but it's a question of whether he decides to accept that his time in the Premier League was ultimately a failure. The Europa League, if we park that and that considerable success for Spurs aside, if he can accept that and walk away from it, he strikes me as the type of character who would want another go at it to prove himself and to prove to everyone else that he's not the sort of joke figure that he got accused of being at the end of his time at Spurs, which I remember before the Europa League final press conference, he dug out the reporter who used that description of him as a clown if he lost that final. He cares about his image. I think he'll want to come back if he can.
Yeah, but you're right. He cares about his image, but he only talks about himself. I mean, you've done lots of press conferences. Did he ever talk about anybody but himself, about what a fighter he is and what a challenge he likes? And it wore a bit thin. But just one thing I want to say on Ange. I mean, I think he was doomed to failure from the start, because there are certain managers and certain clubs that don't work. Rafa Benitez at Everton, Rafa Benitez at Chelsea, George Graham at Tottenham. And I think Ange, because of the style of his play, was never going to work at Nottingham Forest after Nuno. Maybe 20 years ago in Forest were known as the Brian Clough passing team and it was all the time. Fair enough, but this wasn't going to happen. So I think he was doomed to fail to begin with. But, he's only got himself to blame in many ways because of his attitude and because of his tactics.
Yeah, just one last point on the press conferences. I think a big mistake he made was pre-match against Chelsea after the international break. He'll have known every question that was coming in that press conference, and he decided to sort of relitigate his time at Tottenham and not talk about Nottingham Forest and talk about the future. How that was ever going to save his job or change the narrative at Forest was beyond me. But there we are. He's gone. Another man who's left the Premier League is Marcus Rashford, and we're going to be talking about him and El Clasico with Sam Marsden.